Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome to our by design Q&A cafe for, for Business One. That's my fault. So Q&A cafe for Business One. Today on a Thursday in June 11th. Today we have Alex Waddell, and he is going to present on general ledger determinations. So please pay attention for now, and then you can ask some questions later on through the chat or the questions box. In 2 weeks, we'll have, on June 25th, we'll have another Q&A cafe for Business One, creating user-defined fields. So please go ahead and register for that, either on our website or you'll get the registration information in the email that goes out from the GoToWebinar tool. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Alex. I'm just going to put myself on mute.
Great, thank you, Kayla. So welcome everybody. So today's session is on general ledger determinations. If you are already live in SAP Business One, you probably know, have a basic understanding of how GL determinations work. If you're not, then this will give you an introduction, but we'll also get into a little bit more of the sophisticated side of things and kind of run through the difference between the basic GL determinations and then the advanced ones that came out in a more recent release of Business One. So with that, we'll get started. And for now, we'll look at the basic GL determinations, and I'll switch to another environment where we've got the advanced ones turned on. So when it comes to the general ledger determinations, there's a number of different forms that intersect each other as far as GL determinations are concerned. We'll start out by looking at the, I guess, the heart of it. So under your setup, your financials, you have a menu called GL account determination. And this main core setting is where a lot of your fundamental kind of generic accounts, meaning that these are accounts that wouldn't necessarily change depending on the situation. Accounts that would change depending on the situation might be things like revenue or expense. So you'd potentially want to drive things to specific revenue and expense accounts based on the type of product you're selling or the location it's being sold in. Whereas these generic ones, really, it's a single account for accounts receivable, and everything would go to that account. And then you would have variations of that, like a foreign accounts receivable, a checks received, cash on hand. So what I'm going to do today is I'm not going to run through every single one of these and explain them because most of them are fairly obvious. We will spend a little bit more time on the inventory one. I think the important thing is just letting you know where you go in to set this. And if you do have questions, then please put them in the question panel, and I'm happy to try and respond to those if there is an account that you're not sure about. But I will just bring your attention to some of the important ones. So all of these accounts, whether they're an asset account, a liability, or a P&L account, you know, that would obviously depend on the type of account that you're using. And in the case of Business One, because GL accounts are segmented, you're putting in the full segmented account here, so the natural one as well as the different segments that you're going to drive to. If you do have scenarios where you want these segments to change, that's when we're getting into really the advanced GL determinations that we'll talk about shortly. So for each of these tabs, if you're configuring a brand new Business One environment, these come up blank and you would go in and populate these. Every time some of the decisions that you're going to make, like permit change of control accounts, so that meaning that on the document you want to give the user the ability to override an accounts receivable. That could potentially be useful in some scenarios, like for due to, due from intercompany accounts or things like that. Very similar accounts on the purchasing tab. So same idea. So what is the default expense account, the overpayment account, the underpayment account? So where do things get general ledgered automatically based on the fact that it's a payment advance? Where does it go if there is, you know, a realized gain or loss between the time the payable is invoiced and the time it is paid? You know, you would set accounts for things like that. Under the general tab, so these are the ones that are not really specific to any subledger. So your period close, this would be your retained earnings account. That's very important. Your opening balance account that ties into when you set up the system and you're rolling things over. bank charges account. So there's some transactions in the system that could trigger a bank charge, and you could have a GL determination driving that. And then you may notice that there are places where there are blanks. Leaving things blank could be strategically a good idea depending on how you're configuring your system. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but specifically in the case of inventory, you may want to sort of control the ability of people to, set up an item incorrectly and trigger entries if that business scenario doesn't really exist for you. And you could do that strategically by leaving a GL account blank so that they would have a second sort of gateway where they would get an error if somebody tried to book a transaction based on a item that they set up incorrectly. So when we get into the inventory tab, this is the one where we get into quite a bit of complexity as far as what are all of these different accounts doing. And I would say that this probably brings the most sort of confusion to new users. To help you with this, I have an Excel spreadsheet that I'm happy to share with you if you're interested in it. This spreadsheet is a little bit old, so I've done this a few years ago, but things haven't really changed that much. So I've got 3 tabs here, the SAP definitions tab. So if you have worked with GL determinations, you've maybe gone into the SAP help and looked up some of these descriptions. And unfortunately, some of the descriptions are not always completely helpful. Like they may not help you really understand, well, what is the transaction that triggers that event? So I have created, in addition to that, I've taken those same accounts and I've set up another tab where I've put in my own descriptions. And so I've covered all of those same tabs, so the sales tab, and then I've put in here what I would expect you to see as the account type. And oftentimes that kind of helps to just sort of shine the light on what it is that that transaction does. So for example, your domestic accounts receivable, that one's pretty straightforward, but I would expect to see an asset account. And then for your domestic accounts payables, I would expect to see a liability account. And then these samples here, this is not the out-of-the-box chart of account that comes with Business One. This is more of a generic chart of accounts, like what the numbers would look like. But that kind of gives you an idea because typically your assets would start with a 1, your liabilities would start with a 2, your retained earnings a 3, and so on and so forth, all the way down to the bottom of your income statement. And in some cases here, like if you see expense BTL, so below the line, so I would probably expect to see something like a 7,000 or 700,000 or an 800,000 account in there, as that's usually something that's down in sort of the extraordinary gains and losses. So some of those accounts, you'll see those here as well. Cost of goods, examples of those. And so for example, when we get to those inventory accounts, then we have a little bit of a better description on what's going on for all of these. So here's a really good example, the allocation account. That's a very odd description, but it's really, you may know this as GRIR, goods received, invoice receipt, but this is essentially your liability when you do a goods receipt for inventory, where the system is going to credit any goods bought but not yet paid for. So that description alone probably doesn't tell you. Hopefully everything in column G will be a more understandable description. So you're welcome to this spreadsheet if that helps you understand some of those definitions that are in there. And then in addition to that, I have another tab here which has some transaction samples. This looks a little bit complex. Let me just maybe blow this up a little bit. I'm not sure how it shows up on your screen. But here I've sort of correlated those accounts, pretty much the inventory ones, because those are the ones that are typically the most confusing. And so same thing that we talked about there. So there's inventory, there's your allocation, there's expense, there's purchase credit, there's cost of goods, such and so forth. So this chart would help you understand what is the actual transaction that's triggering it. So for example, if you were to do a purchase order, there is never a financial impact. So it does place a commitment on the inventory. So you potentially see in your inventory that there's one less potential quantity of an item available to you to sell. This is a purchase order, so a quantity ready to come in or placed on order. And then conversely, available for you to sell. And then the goods receipt PO, there's different flavors of that. So I've created 3 different rows of that because on a goods receipt PO, you could have a inventory item, a non-inventory item, or an inventory item with the standard costing turned on. So this gives you a really good idea, well, what are the actual accounts that are going to be hit? So in this example, you would have a debit to your inventory account, and you would have a credit to that allocation account that I mentioned. And then in row number 3 here, I've put in like a little bit of a description, so same thing. So balance sheet inventory, goods received not invoiced, expense account. So you've got that plain English. Typically I use this template if we're setting up a brand new environment for a client. I will give them this exact template and ask them to tell me what GL account they want in each of these fields here, and we'll make those updates, and that's how we will design their GL determinations. So as you work your way down this list, you'll see that if you do a goods receipt for non-inventory, we talked about this a little bit during the last B1 Q&A Cafe, there is no journal entry for non-inventory. If you did a standard cost item, you would still get a credit to the allocation account, but you would get a debit to this account here, so the account in the system that's flagged as variance. And then in some cases where I have a superscript, so I've got number 5, standard cost items are only used, handle family integration with field view. So if you are a client of ours that's using field view and we are importing assets through these GL determinations, one of the workaround solutions we have is to create your fixed assets at standard cost 0, and then we set this variance account to be the clearing account that we debit in order to bring those assets into your system. So for example, for fixed asset management from a third party, or from fixed assets that need to be set up in field view manually. So I won't go through each one of these. I will just mention that some of them where I've got things in brackets, I do have a little legend down here that explains that. So if the C or the D, the credit or the debit is in brackets, that event is going to occur because there is no preceding document. So in this example, you're buying an inventory invoice, inventory item on an AP invoice, but you do not have a preceding document, meaning you're paying an invoice in the system without having done a goods receipt, then the event would be slightly different. You would have a debit of the inventory on this transaction, and you would have a credit to your accounts payable liability. If you did have a preceding document, then this document would have been in play. This document would have been in play. So you would then have had your inventory debited here. So now instead, you're going to have your debit on the allocation account to clear out the credit that was booked earlier up here. So these two effectively cancel each other out. So keep that in mind. You've got these notes down here that kind of help you with different ways that we've configured the system for clients in the past. So for example, adjusting for intercompany balances. I've also included some color coding, so credits or debits for sales. So once again, if you have a transaction where you maybe don't have a preceding document, you may have multiple journal entries triggered on that document. So you could have your revenue entries being booked, and you could have your cost entries being booked on the same document. So keep that in mind as well. And then down here for some of your inventory transactions, like a stock transfer, you would always debit and credit inventory. It could be the same or it could be different inventory accounts. All depends on how you've set up your GL determinations, and we'll look at that in just a moment. So this guide will help you out. In the meantime, I'm going to pop back into SAP. So that pretty much covers all of those accounts that we talked about there. For your resources and your WIP mapping, these really relate to setting up manufacturing. So I'm not going to get into this today because we probably don't have time for that. But if you do have questions around GL determinations for resource and costing as far as manufacturing, we could help you with that outside of this. So that was the first intersection. The next intersection is really on the items themselves through either item groups, warehouses, or the item itself. So if we go into inventory and we bring up that item master data table, I'm going to do a search here, and you can see that I added this column, set GL accounts by. So we can see here that we have accounts that are set by item group or item warehouse. And then there is a third option I'll show you as well. So if we were to open up one of these items, this setting, which is on the inventory data tab, so it's this field right here, One other thing I'll mention is a lot of these settings are changeable at any time, so you can change the way GL determinations behave. I could set this to be warehouse from this point onwards. I can go into those previous screens where GL accounts were set up and change those out. But be very cautious with that because you likely have history involved, historical transactions. It is not going to modify or correct any of your history. So for example, if you did have inventory pointing to one GL account and you were to change that, you'd want to make sure that you've actually removed all the inventory out of that GL account through subledger transactions before making those changes. So keep that in mind. This is all changeable, but potentially very dangerous to change it. So when I set up an item to be determined by the group, I've got a gold arrow here by my item groups. So I've got numerous groups. And then what I'm saying is that based on which grouping this item belongs to, so in this case, this is a definable by you, how many groups, some different types of items that you sell in your system. The B1 reporting relies heavily on breaking things out by groups, and your GL determinations have that same capability. So because this is assigned to the industrial group, if I were to open up the groups, you would see that when I create the groups, the general tab has a bunch of information for inventory management. But in addition to that, there's an accounting tab where you will now recognize all of those same GL accounts that we saw in that inventory tab, where now we can override what's happening in the core GL determinations and say, I want this item group to take priority, meaning that if I were to sell this particular item or buy this particular item, it would hit the expense account and the revenue account and the inventory account, and depending on whatever I'm doing, so if I'm doing standard costing, if I've got variances involved, if I'm doing manufacturing, I can dictate whether I want a same or different GL account to be triggered here. So if I were to navigate through these records, so there's my services, and in this demo environment, they're not really set up to be different, but what I would expect to see if you were using this feature is that your service labor would hit a completely different expense account and your revenue would hit a completely different revenue account. And that would be the reason that you're using item group determination on your particular items. So from a maintenance perspective, this is a fairly reasonable way to do things because you have many items in your system. You could have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of items, but you probably only have a handful of groups. And so you've got a many to few relationship where you're saying all of my many items are being distilled down to be GL determined by these groups. So that's option one. Option two is you could decide to do your GL determinations by your warehouses, meaning that it's not the nature of the item that I sell, it's the location where the item exists that is what I care about. So if I go down here to an item that is governed by warehouse, then I'm saying that regardless of the item group, I want the GL determination to be determined by one of these three variables. So whether it's the general warehouse, West Coast, or drop ship. How do I know what GL accounts? Same concept. So instead of drilling down to the group, I drill down to the warehouse and I go to the accounting tab. And you can see all those same GL accounts. And now I'm essentially saying that my revenue, my expense, my inventory is governed by the warehouse because that's how I've set this specific field on this particular item. How your GL accounts are determined, the default is set up in higher system settings, but you can override it at every single item and you can do what's been done in this environment where you've got sort of a mix and match. So you now might be wondering, well, what if I really want to have different revenue or different expenses based on not only the item, but also on the warehouse? I essentially want both of these things to be working together. So that is viable in the system. I am going to show you how it was set up traditionally because this is all the traditional way of doing GL determinations, which is still completely available to you and you may be potentially using this. The way that you would do it then is you would set your GL accounts to be based on the item level. Now, as soon as I do that, what is going to happen is your GL accounts are now going to become available to you inside every single item on this grid. Here I'm only seeing the revenue, but if I were to go to my form settings, I could scroll down and I could activate, you know, as many of those accounts that I want. And then I could say that I want a specific revenue account because this particular item at this particular warehouse should go into a certain account. And this is where your segmented accounting is probably coming into play, because you're probably saying that one of these segments represent, you know, location or geography. And so you would potentially have like warehouse 1 is tied to segment 1, and here tied to value 2 in segment 1, and by, you know, tied to that. So this type of setting gives you a lot of flexibility. However, it is a huge, like a monumental effort to maintain, because now you're talking about intersecting every single one of your items. So if you have thousands of items, multiplied by your number of groups, multiplied by your number of warehouses, essentially all the intersections of these many fields, columns, and rows across all your items. So it's a big job to maintain this and set it up. And typically, we would not advise it unless you have strong business reason to do that, and potentially a lot of control over who sets up and maintains your item master data. Now, fortunately, this method is all but obsolete now because of something called the advanced GL determinations. Advanced GL determinations have been around since version 9.0, which I believe is like 2012. So chances are, if you have been implemented in the last 8 years, you may be using advanced GL determinations. There is a document so on how to set it up in SAP. We can send you this link. If you just Google advanced GL determinations, is probably the first thing that'll come up. But this SAP document is quite good. So it explains exactly how they work. And I'm going to give you a quick introduction to that right now. So if we go into a system initialization and your general settings, sorry, I think I got that wrong. Your company details, my apologies. And then go to your basic initialization tab. Here is the field where you would have enabled advanced GL account determinations. So if this is not turned on, it could be activated at any time. Do not be careless though about activating this, because it is a process, especially if you do have a existing environment with historical transactions. Likely you're going to want to work with us to have a strategy. The document explains that strategy a little bit. There is a wizard that offers to do a conversion of your current GL determinations and sort of intelligently convert them into advanced. And typically that intelligence is not 100% successful. So you could run it, but then you're going to want to review it really carefully and probably adjust some of the decisions that the system made. So if this is a feature that you don't currently have turned on, that you're thinking about turning on, please feel free to reach out to VistaView. We'd be happy to help you with you know, a project that would focus on doing that right. Now, if you do have that setting turned on, it's going to look a little different than what I've gone in and shown you so far. So we're going to go into OEC computers, which currently does have it turned on. So your advanced GL determinations is going to give you an engine that gives you a bit of intelligence that you can use to create your GL determinations that essentially replaces the item level component of it. So I'm going to go to the same place I was before, to my setup, my financials, and my GL account determinations. And you can see that there's a couple of extra things turned on in here: determination criteria, resources, and inventory. So when I go into here, this screen looks very familiar. The only difference is now I have a button called advanced, and I also have advanced rules. So what that is telling us is that there is now a combination of things going on. So the heart of the GL determinations still exist here. You would still set this up very similar to the way you have done it in the traditional method. Many of these accounts would be determined based on what you're setting in here, but potentially things like revenue, cost of goods, and expenses, you want to drive those out into more detail and you want to build that in a single grid instead of having to do it inside hundreds or thousands of individual item master records. And so you would do that by creating advanced rules. So I will just pop in and open up ones that have already been created and show you these as an example. So this works in conjunction with what you're seeing in the GL account determination, only now you have the ability to build your own combinations inside this one single panel. Each of these would have to be given a code that you design. You would decide what the priority is. So this is important because you want to ensure that if you have any overlapping rules, that you have made intelligent choices on the order of processing these rules. So for example, if I were to have a rule which is looking at all item groups, and then I have another rule which is looking at a specific item group, it's going to work its way down, and as soon as it finds a rule that applies, it's going to trigger that transaction. So it may be the case where this rule should be above the other one. And I can't say that for certain because I haven't really dug into what's going on with the ship to country, but that'll just be part of designing this. So this is where it definitely is a bit of a project. You're going to want to kind of whiteboard out what are the variables that I'm interested in seeing in my GL determinations to make the decisions. So this particular one has got a bit of complexity because somebody has added the ship to country. But here we've got the item group and we've got the warehouse. And so these would be very common ones. So just with these two columns, I could essentially replace the intelligence that's happening within the item level determination of the items. Those fields are not even available to you anymore. So if I were to go open up a specific item, I can't get to those GL accounts once I've activated this advanced engine in the system. And then all of the fields that you have seen in the previous screens are now across the columns. So you would make a decision on what you want to book into those fields. Anything that's left blank could be strategically blank to trigger an error if that's an event that you don't expect to happen, or if you expect the GL account to be governed by something in one of these higher up rules in here. So in this particular case, because you have the ability to see all of your items and all of your warehouses, it's a very simple matter to just start creating new rules in the system and then simply say this combination of, let's say, servers with, a specific warehouse will go to a specific GL account. And you can work your way through it like that. A couple other things about the advanced GL determination rules. So there is a period indicator. So the determination rules do roll forward, but you could create different rules for different periods. So if the nature of your business is changing in the future, you can set up a specific time period where you want the system to behave differently and choose different GL accounts based on that. So that's a feature there. Don't get too confused about that. And there is some ability to import these GL account determination rules. If you are getting into a lot of variables, you could potentially have hundreds of rows in here that the engine is going to kind of work through, depending on the number of groups that you have or the number of variables. So just to wrap this up, let's talk a little bit about what those other variables could be. So if I go to the determination criteria, you can see that I do have the ability to activate other fields, even user-defined fields. So I could actually create my own fields associated with different objects in the system, like different items that I sell. And then I want that to be a column located inside here, and I want to govern different GL accounts based on that custom design field. And then in addition to that, SAP has decided that potentially these 10 out-of-the-box fields could also trigger a different GL determination. So ship to state, ship to country, those are ones that kind of make sense. So potentially where you're selling the product, where the business partner's ship to address is, perhaps that is going to impact the way that you record revenue or expense in your system. You could also add the business partner group. So that might be another one that is very useful for, let's say, intercompany suppliers or associated suppliers or vendors or customers where you want to drive something to a different revenue or expense account so that you could more easily eliminate it on some sort of consolidated financials. That would be very useful. So by simply activating one of those fields, that's going to add it to this grid, and it's going to give you that sort of additional permutations of combinations of accounts that you can add to the system. So that's a lot of information that's to get through in a short time. Maybe I'm just going to pause there and see if there are any questions. So I will just give that one moment. And Kayla, it looks like I'm not seeing the question panel for some reason. So maybe you can let me know if you see any questions pop up.
I don't see any at this time. Yeah, the chat is empty. There's no questions in there yet. We don't have any right now.
Okay. Then I guess I'll start to wrap up. If you do have a question and you think of it later, feel free to reach out to us. I'll turn this back to Kayla. She's going to talk a little bit about where you can find the recording of this and the Excel spreadsheet if you're interested in that as a tool as well. Thanks, Kayla.
Yeah, so the recording will be going out in the auto email that comes from the GoToWebinar tool. But I also upload it to our YouTube channel, our Vista Solutions YouTube channel, and then also you can find it in like a playlist for Business One training series. So that's there. I don't have a way to put this Excel document for you, Alex, but I'm sure you can email it out to those who attended.
Sure, that'd be fine.
Okay, great. All right, if there's nothing else, we can close this out for today. Make sure that you are registering for our next one in 2 weeks' time, and we'll see you then, and have a great week and weekend.
Great, thanks.